Welcome to the Reason and Theology Show. I'm your host, Michael Lofton, on a Wednesday evening discussing Thomism and various Thomistic questions with Erick a Roman Catholic, Dru, and he's going to be helping out with the phones and, of course, the chats and perhaps throwing in some input from the atheist perspective. And then our guest, Zachary Robert, who is a student of philosophy at Hillsdale College, who runs a small YouTube channel, Zachary Robert, which is dedicated to philosophical explorations. His interests are in medieval philosophy and scholasticism. Zachary, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Yes, sir. It's good to have you.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
Hey, I really enjoyed your video that you did answering Eastern Orthodox misconceptions. I thought that was very interesting. So just for a point of reference, anybody who's watching, you can go to Zachary Robert YouTube channel, and one of the videos that you'll see, it should be one of the first ones that comes up is various Eastern Orthodox objections to Roman Catholicism, and Zachary deals with some of those there. And I want to discuss that with you today, if that's okay. Maybe if you could perhaps go over a few of these misconceptions that you believe Eastern Orthodox have about Roman Catholicism.
Right. So a lot of these objections with I dealt with in the video, right? The main one being modal collapse, and then the other ones being like synonymity of predicates and stuff like that. All are related to this claim that God is divinely simple, the actus purus claim. Which Orthodox claim to not have a problem with the idea that God is divinely simple, which I think, we can take their word for that, right? But they kind of have issues with more so certain things that we derive from that claim. And they're going to want to try to, obviously separate the operations or energeia of God from his essence. And the way that they're going to do this generally is they don't really have like a sort of syllogistic way where they can reason from sort of natural principles to the conclusion that God's energies must be distinct. Generally, the way that I see them arguing is they sort of start from the opponent's position, which is our position, the actus purus claim, and then they say, well, it can't be actus purus because it leads to some absurdity, like all the exemplars are identical in God's mind, or something like that. Now, there's several problems with that, in my view, mainly that just because our position is absurd, which I don't think that they can establish for reasons that I'll get into very soon, that doesn't necessarily mean that their position is correct either. And I also never see them attacking head-on the argument from motion, right, which leads you to that conclusion that God is purely actual. Right. So that's just kind of a prefatory thing to, some of the ideas that I get into in the video and sort of framing the debate. The things that I get into the video, the first thing is modal collapse. Right. And modal collapse is, as far as I'm aware, right, the forms that we see are it's a rather modern argument, although apparently there are analogous arguments actually made in Palamite, which was pointed out to me by a friend of mine who is Orthodox. So apparently this objection is as old as Palamite, but it doesn't hold up. And the basic gist of this argument goes something like this, right? Necessarily God exists, right? And if God is identical to God's act of creation, right, which is, something we Thomists would hold because we would want to say that any predicate is identical to the essence, right? Because we don't want to introduce any accidents, anything that inheres in the substance, because for Aquinas that would imply distinction, which we can get to later. There's a lot of qualifications. But the conclusion then from there is that necessarily God's act of creation exists. Now, the problem with that is that that's an invalid form of the syllogism. Any way that you're going to formulate modal collapse is going to be using an invalid form of the syllogism, and therefore is a completely just bunk argument. And the first person to point out that this form of the syllogism is invalid was actually a postmodern philosopher by the name of Quine. And Quine points out with a very famous example of the planets, right, which I talk about in my video, that we can have the same form of the syllogism if we just switch the terms up a little bit. We can say necessarily 8 is greater than 7. And then we can say, well, the number of planets is equal to 8. Therefore, it is the case that the number of planets is necessarily greater than 7. Mm-hmm. But we know that that's not the case, right? Because it could fail to be the case that there are 8 planets, right? Mm-hmm. One of them could cease to exist because we're talking about contingent beings. Right. And so that's the big thing here is that for the modal collapse argument to work, right, for this objection to the actus purus claim to work, there would need to be a necessity operator in both the first and second premise for the conclusion to also follow necessarily. And that's demonstrated very clearly by Quine's example. So that's, the first big objection that I generally hear from the Orthodox is modal collapse. And that argument doesn't follow. And if they can't attack the argument for motion, if they can't attack the claim which establishes actus purus, then their only option that they're left with is to sort of argue from absurdity against the actus purus claim, which is what the modal collapse argument attempts to do, but actually fails to do.
Yeah, and you're essentially saying this argument of modal collapse is the idea that, well, basically in God, everything is isomorphically identified, and so it just causes, this internal contradiction if God is absolutely simple. Yeah.
Yeah, basically there's no freedom in his action, right? And we wouldn't want to say, that, right? Because we want to maintain that God freely created the world. And, if God didn't freely create the world, or basically this would not only lead to God's act of creation not being free, but it would also lead to nothing being free, right? Everything would be completely necessary, but the argument just doesn't follow. And the funny thing about the modal collapse argument is that this argument even applies to the Orthodox, regardless of whether or not you hold to the essence energy distinction, right?
How so?
I can explain, because we can take the modal collapse argument and we can reformulate it in a way which applies to anyone, regardless of whether or not they believe in, the specifics of their theology. We can say necessarily God exists, right? God is identical to the creator. Necessarily the creator exists. So does that mean that God is necessarily the creator? He could not have failed to have been the creator. This seems to also induce a sort of modal collapse, which the Orthodox oftentimes, or opponents of divine simplicity, will throw out, right? This applies to any monotheist, anyone who believes that God created all existence.
Couldn't they just say, well, only after God chooses to create? Wouldn't that maybe perhaps be a valid response, or how would you interact with that?
So I'm not quite sure if I understand what you're saying. Are you saying if like God is
God is only necessarily the creator after he wills to create, but he doesn't necessarily, he's not constrained to will to create?
Well, when we say that something's necessarily the case, we're saying that it could not fail to be the case. So then it wouldn't be necessary, right? Because there would be a point in time where God was not the creator, right? And it could have failed to have been the case. And so it's not necessary, but it's rather a contingency, right?
Necessary based upon a prior, assuming that he wills, though. You're differentiating, I suppose, between perhaps a ultimate necessity and perhaps a necessity after God has chosen, though, correct? Wouldn't there be a distinction between the two? Or you're just saying there's absolutely, it's only necessary. I suppose I'm not phrasing it correctly. Eric, do you see what I'm getting at? Maybe you could phrase it in a different way. Help me out here. Is your mic on? Let me see. Hold up. Try now.
How about now?
Yeah.
Okay. Are you talking about the distinction between relative necessity and absolute necessity?
Essentially, yeah, because it seems like there would be a distinction between the two. If
Oh,
God has
yeah.
already chosen to will, then there's some necessity, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he had to choose to will. So I guess you could distinguish between essential
Yeah.
and relative.
Yeah, I think what Zachary's talking to is something that could not fail to be. So, for example, I think Aquinas uses the example of long distance travel. You could walk and take a long way, or you could, you could use means that are conducive to the end.
Yeah.
And so if you use, let's say, if you fly a plane from here to China, that becomes, somewhat of a necessity. That's
Exactly.
a certain kind of necessity. But then I think Aquinas also talks about the necessity in God when he has decided something, even through a free agency. And that I think he uses the analogy of somebody who is sitting down, they don't necessarily sit down, but if they sit down, and insofar as they are sitting, they necessarily sit.
But they don't have to sit. So
But they don't
there's
have to
not
sit.
a necessity to having to sit,
Right. I think that's where I think that's the delineation there on that.
Exactly.
Okay.
So is that not a perhaps valid objection that an Eastern Orthodox could level in response to what you're saying, Zachary?
Right. So I think that the problem, I understand what you're saying now. And the problem that I would see with that is that would still be an invalid form of the syllogism for the very reason that in that very first premise, the type of necessity that we're talking about, such as the necessity of God's existence, is not the same thing as a sort of relative necessity, right? And so if you're going to have the conclusion also be, right, absolutely necessary, right, which is what they want to say, right? Because we could even say, as Roman Catholics, like I think anyone could say that, right, in the example of sitting, right, insofar as the person is sitting, right, they are necessarily doing so. Insofar as God is creating, he's necessarily doing so. But that doesn't entail modal collapse, right? So if they want to establish modal collapse, what they would have to do is they would have to establish an absolute necessity. It could not be a relative necessity, right? Because then that he could have it could have been done freely, and that wouldn't entail a form of modal collapse.
Now, how does this happen if God's will to create is identical with his essence, unless you're going to make some kind of distinction between his will to create and his essence?
Well, what I think, right, is that I don't see exactly why it must be the case, right, that because there is, right, an identity of predicates in God, that it must be the case then, right, because this is the same thing that's happening with the modal collapse argument again, right, which is that you would have to establish that God's will is necessarily identical, right, to his essence. And what I mean by that, right, is that just because God is necessarily exists, right, and that is something that is necessarily the case, and absolutely so, you would also have to establish that all things that are predicated of him are also necessarily predicated of him in that same way, right? Why must it be a good way to point this out, right, is Aquinas uses an example of the fact that there are things which could exist but do not exist, right? So there are things which are logically possible, right? Like a unicorn is logically possible, for example. Right. There's not anything per se about a horse with a horn that is logically impossible, but it doesn't exist. And what this demonstrates then is that God's will, right, he could have willed into existence something which is not in existence, which seems to imply, right, that God's will, right, though God's existence is necessarily the case, those things that we predicate of him are not necessarily the case, right? Because God's act of creation, right, you would have to establish that things like God's act of creation, God's will, or anything that we predicate of him is necessarily so. And I don't know how you would do that. And if you do that, that is not only a problem for That is not only a problem for Roman Catholics, but that's also a problem for anyone holding to monotheism. And I don't think that you can successfully demonstrate that God's will is necessarily one way, just because of predicating it of his existence being necessarily the case, right?
So how does that not create a difficulty with God's simplicity? If you're now going to make some distinctions, would you say that distinction does not create division or separation or composition, or how would you deal with the simplicity of God in that case?
Right. So it depends upon what kind of distinctions we're talking about, right? We can have distinctions in God, right? But there's something, there's real distinctions, right? Like distinctions of parts or whatever. Or there are other sorts of distinctions, right? We can have distinctions via, sort of relation or virtual distinction, or even as your last guest, Professor Goff brought up on the podcast, you have a formal distinction as introduced by Scotus. And so what I would say is when we're talking about things like God's will or any of these other things that we're predicating of him, as far as I understand, the Thomistic position, right, is that these sorts of things are virtual distinctions, right? Because we are composite beings and we think composite thoughts. And so what we do is we are with our intellect sort of expounding upon one facet of God's divine essence, though it is not actually distinct. And just because, right, these are not actually distinct in God doesn't mean that we aren't actually thinking about something that is real. And I believe Aquinas talks about this, where he says, what is truth, justice, or beauty, right? If not, it doesn't have some sort of reality in the divine essence, or some sort of existence in the divine essence, right? But that doesn't necessarily entail, right, that these things must be distinct within the divine essence, right? But what this rather entails, because this is sort of a similar thing that the Orthodox will talk about, is they'll talk about the fact that, well, how can we even talk about these concepts, right, if the divine essence is unknowable? Well, even if the divine essence is unknowable, right, we can still understand certain facets of the divine essence, these things like truth, beauty, and justice, which all have their bearing in the divine essence and are elements of it. Or I should be careful with my words, maybe not elements of it, but it's one component or facet of the divine essence.
Sorry, I had my mic muted there, so it took a second to unmute. I have a quote that I wanted to read to you that's very much related to what we're discussing, that I was just reading earlier today. This is from the dialogue between an Orthodox and a Palamite, which is, of course, from the work of Gregory Palamas. And here he's quoting from Basil, and he says, quote, quoting from Basil, it is clear lunacy to claim that there is not a specific signification underlying each divine name. So from a Thomist perspective, sounds like you're adopting the virtual distinction. Would you say, since there's no real distinction in God, this is just something that's more virtually in our mind because we're composite beings, is there a way that you could still say that, yes, each of the divine names have specific significations? Or would you perhaps have to take issue with that? How would you understand somebody like St. Basil who has these kinds of quotes?
Right. So Aquinas actually deals with this in the Summa Theologica when he's talking about the divine exemplars. Basically, the divine exemplars are sort of the blueprints for everything that exists in the world. They exist in the mind of God. And what he has to say about that is that while these exemplars, or while these things which are being signified in the mind of God are not actually distinct, they are multiplied by their relations to things outside of themselves, right? To each of the things which they correspond.
Okay, so because they have relation to things outside himself, they
Right.
can be considered in one form or another distinct. though
Right,
not
correct.
creating composition within God.
Right,
Okay.
correct. Because that's how we would talk about the Trinity generally, is through relations of oppositions, right? As a result of Augustine and his treatise on the Trinity.
Yeah. Okay. No, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
Yeah. So basically, I don't think that there is I don't think that there's necessarily any sort of issue here. I mean, generally, I guess when I'm talking to Eastern Orthodox about these sorts of things like synonymity of predicates, a lot of times they have a sort of aversion to a lot of these subtle distinctions. But I think that these subtle distinctions are important ultimately because all of what we're doing, right, all of these distinctions and so on that we have are sort of to preserve the actus purus claim, right? Because for me personally, as a theist, I do not think that there is any way to, I've not seen a refutation of the argument for motion, which in my mind establishes so well the actus purus claim. And because of that, right, we have to, I think that, it is worthwhile to create these distinctions, to create these sort of conceptual frameworks in which we talk about God in a way which preserves these sorts of things about him, like his absolute divine simplicity, right?
Yeah, and you know what, I would agree with you. Based upon philosophical grounds alone, it would seem that one has to conclude that God is pure act. But for those who would say that's not good enough for me, you got to show it to me in the church fathers. Of course, I would always want to retort, well, you still have to answer how do we account for change? But aside from that issue, could you maybe, are there any fathers who affirmed that God is pure act? I was trying to do a keyword search the other day. That it didn't yield any results. That doesn't mean that there weren't any fathers who said it, but couldn't find anything in my simple studies there. Do you know of any fathers offhand who adopted this Aristotelian notion that God is pure act? And Eric, I'm going to come to you in just a second here.
Yeah, so this is stepping a little bit out of my area of sort of interest when it comes to church history and stuff like that. But I would imagine that would be something that Eric would.
Yeah, Eric, I don't know if you want to jump in here, if you know it of any fathers who identified God as pure act, and also if you had any additional questions or comments for Zachary.
Yeah, well, there's definitely church fathers that talk about the simplicity of God. Sometimes they won't say simplicity. Sometimes they'll say that in the essence of God is nothing but, sameness or equality of everything. So,
but do they say pure act, that actual term? Do they identify them with that metaphysical concept?
I vaguely remember something like this in St. Augustine.
Okay,
but I can't. I don't know the citation offhand.
It's odd that Damascene doesn't, at least to my knowledge, just because he's coming from an Aristotelian perspective. I don't know if anybody in the chat can correct me and show me where he says it, maybe in the Orthodox faith, but you would think he would be the one who would actually say that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, I think what Zachary says is absolutely true, though, that the Orthodox who have some valid, they have valid concerns when it comes to responding to Aquinas, is there has to be some real philosophical work here. There can't be just an objection thrown out there, because as Aquinas would say, there is a point where all of us have to put a cork in it when it comes to divine revelation. For example, we all have a modified form of divine simplicity to match, for example, relational opposition for Trinitarian persons. You won't get there through natural theology. But when it comes to first principle, the argument of motion, you can't have parts. You can't have broken pieces that come together in God. And that is a question that I don't really see being addressed. So, for example, if you listen to the debate between the Thomist, Mr. Feingold, and Jay Dyer, Jay Dyer was listing names and an objection, and Feingold kept going back to the real philosophical tour of where this all begins with Actus Purus. It all begins with the fact that in God, you can't have a composition as to first principle. And if we can't get past that, we're not going to get off the ground when it comes to theism in general. So I agree with Zach that this is what hinges here is the survival of monotheism. And if we're going to oppose that, we can't just nitpick at it. We also have to offer an alternative which can speak to the fact that in God, there are not pieces that come together and form who he is in his essence, yeah, there's a different starting point. You have the Dionysian starting point. You have the beyond being, super essential, being and essence that is not really being. So it's not a real thing. You read this in St. John of Damascus, where, well, we can't really speak about anything in God, because things that we predicate about things are created, or there are ways that have condescended to us in order for us to understand something about God. But we really can't say anything about God, in his essence. I did want to read a citation from St. Gregory Palamas. I don't know if we're ready for that yet, but I did want to explore this, because he says something here that really gets to what we're talking about. And this is coming from the 34th chapter of his physical chapters.
Okay. From the 150 chapters?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, this is 100. I think they number 150. Yes, this is my title says physical chapters, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it's the 34th chapter from the one that's published by the Pontifical Institute for Medieval Studies. If you that one, it's
yeah. So I think they come up to 150, right? But I have an English translation from a guy who's well into this, but he's probably not going to want his name publicized here. But I can read the Greek if somebody in the chat wants me to. But here's what it says. It says, and there is no distinction. Okay, there is no distinction between life and wisdom and goodness. For the goodness embraces all things collectively and unitively and in utter simplicity. And what's key there is the Greek part where, it says uk estin diaphora. There is no distinction. And, he posits this about life and wisdom and goodness, and how all of this is collective and unified in utter simplicity and sameness. So that, to me, seems to indicate that Palamas is aware that there can't be a distinction in God, even when it comes to these predications, and I'd be curious to know if Zachary has heard from any of his Orthodox interlocutors on what kind of simplicity Palamas is presenting through them, because there's been recent scholarship done that is, quite a slight bit different than what we hear from, for example, the works like God, History, and Dialectic by Joseph Farrell, and some of the other more Platonic Orthodox thinkers who have, really seen that Palamas is working with this complexity, But here we go, we have no distinction between life and goodness and all of these attributes. So I think that this is something to look at. And I also have a quote from Maximus, but let's pause there. And what have you heard from
Zachary? Do you have any comments? Oh, I'm sorry, Eric.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so interestingly enough, I mean, I don't really understand what Orthodox mean when they talk about simplicity. Right now, I say that kind of in jest, right? Because what does it really mean to be simple if you can have like accidents inhering, right, in God, right? Because it seems to be the case that any sort of an accident makes the thing be in some sort of a way, and then it's become composite as a result of that. And you know, they because they'll often try to make some sort of a distinction between operations or energeia or whatever.
Mhm.
And the big problem with that though is that if an accident is that which inheres in a substance, right? Do operations not inhere in a substance? Do they just sort of, right?
Mhm.
Is it not the case that if I were to be running, right, that is something that is predicated of me, that I am running, right? That energy or that operation is something that's predicated of me, right? Because if we look at Aristotle's categories, right, acting upon or being acted upon is another category, right, which would be another predicate of existence and another accident. And so, what I don't really understand is how they can try to establish that, or how Orthodox will try to establish that they do believe in divine simplicity, but they at the same time believe that you can predicate accidents upon the Godhead. Now, Eric brought up a very interesting thing, which was the debate between Dr. Feingold and Jay Dyer. And the interesting thing about that debate was that they did sort of get into whether or not accidents could be predicated of God or what is considered an accident. And I think that there was a point in that debate where Dr. Feingold brought up something where he said he's a bit of a heterodox Thomist when it comes to what he considers to be introducing or inducive of a distinction in the Godhead. And I guess if you were to ask me what does simplicity mean for the Orthodox, well, I would have to think that it would involve some sort of a thing where they either are not defining operations as accidents, or they're doing something where they don't believe that all accidents introduce, composition or distinction. But then if that's the case, how do you get around the sort of big question or the big thing with accidents, which is, isn't it the case that accidents make a thing be in some sort of a way, right? That seems like a really intuitive way of thinking about accidents. And so I don't know how you would formulate some other form of predicates for beings where you would get around this. So that's why I said at the beginning, I don't really know what the Orthodox position on simplicity
Now,
would be.
in fairness to the Orthodox, I've never heard an Orthodox affirm that the energies are accidental properties inhering in the substance. I've never heard that. If you could maybe show me an Orthodox who said that, that would be
Sure.
That would be interesting, because I want to read something from Palamite himself, because I think Palamite would disagree with that. He says, for a while that remains altogether imparticipable and unseen and without a name, God makes himself known by them in many ways, and he is participated in through them, because they are not at all separated from it. For he is one God in essence and activity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So he's indicating, though there is a distinction between essence and energies, they are not separated from each other, and he is still one God within essence and activity. So I don't know how any individual could say that the energies are accidents inhering in a substance. Maybe if you can point one out, that'd be good.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So I don't mean to say,
Yeah.
and it probably came off as that's the Orthodox position. What I'm saying is that if you were to try to salvage the Orthodox position or reconcile divine simplicity with any sort of distinction within the Godhead, then the way that you would have to do that is you would have to, I guess, rethink how we think about operations, right? You would have to think of them as something which is not accidental, which it is. I suppose that that is generally what you will see, is that they will try to I suppose they have a different way of thinking about operations, which I guess kind of gets down to the main point of contention here, is how we think about operations and whether or not they are things that are going to be introducing some sort of a distinction. And as far as that question's concerned, how we think about operation, that's not a question that I am. It's not a question that I'm like sort of too one way or the other on, right? Although from my point of view, what it does seem to be, right, is that it does seem to me to be the case that if there is some operation, right, some operation, you are being made to be in some sort of a way, right? Like you are running or you are creating, and in that action, right, you are existing in some sort of a way, right, which you could have failed to have existed in. And so it does seem to be the case, right, that operations, right, from my point of view, are introducing a problem for simplicity, where we don't want to be introducing any sort of change to God's being, right? We want to avoid, or at least I want to avoid, saying that God is being made to be in any sort of way, whether that's through his operations or accidents or anything that we're going to predicate of him. He just is, right?
Yeah. Well, if y'all don't mind, let me read another quote for y'all and toss this out and maybe see if it kind of interacts with what you were saying, Eric. First, I'll get your thoughts on it, Zachary, and then come back to you, Eric. And then I have one final question before we get to the chat and any live calls. So Eric, you were reading a quote where it seems that the attributes are identified with the essence, right? That's pretty much the gist. And it's interesting, the Palamite brings this up with Gregory. And let's see, he says, and this is the Palamite speaking, he says, but they also cite some words of the saints as evidence, which declare that the essence and the activity of God are one. Do the saints then on that account fall into the same absurdities? Well, Gregory says, not at all. The Palamite asks, how is that? And then Gregory says, because they call them one, but not indifferent, i.e., the same and not the same in different manners. Hence, you will find them saying in the one place the same and in another different, because in their view, they are both. So could it be that when we come to the fathers and we see some of these passages where it seems that they are identifying them together, but then we come to these other passages by the same authors and it seems that they're distinguishing them? Could it be that maybe they're distinguishing them in one particular way and identifying them in a different kind of way? What do you think, Zachary?
Well, okay. So I guess when it comes to any time where I guess the sort of crux of what we're talking about with that quote here is, I mean, any time that we are, I think, dealing with the fathers or their writings, I think that particularly with the issue of divine simplicity, or any time we're talking about anything that's going to be predicated of the Godhead, right? We're obviously going to be making distinctions, right, in one way or another, right? Because, like has been said earlier, we're composite beings who think composite thoughts. And so we're always going to be making conceptual frameworks or, whatever. We're going to be making distinctions. Now, the real I guess the substance of the problem here is what do we mean when we are making these sorts of distinctions, right? Are we talking about a distinction in the same sort of a way that we would say that there's a distinction between a part and a whole, or like how a brick makes up a brick wall, right? So I don't think that when we're talking about God, or when anyone's talking about God, nobody's going to be talking about integral parts, right? So we all know that and integral parts are being like the parts of a brick wall, where each brick, forms the wall. We are not going to be talking about integral parts. And so when it comes down to this, I think that the sort of conceptual framework that we're using, or that the fathers are using, right? I think that it's going to be highly. I think that we're going to have to read the fathers in their own context, right? And we're going to have to understand, right, that anytime when I often see Orthodox or Catholics going back to the church fathers and sort of either importing Palamism or importing Thomism into the fathers. And it's a very common thing within the Eastern Orthodox, where I have read significant portions of Damascene, right? And it's oftentimes I'll have these portions of Damascene pointed out to me by my Orthodox friends, and they'll tell me, read this. Doesn't this just prove that it's the case that the essence energy distinction is the case? But I can look at that and I can read Damascene and I can say, well, I don't see how this is like teaching essence energy. At best, it's a sort of very underdeveloped form of the essence energy distinction, right? And so when we go back to the fathers, right, I think that the important thing to look at is, I don't think that we should be thinking that, Damascene is a Thomist or a Palamite, right? He's writing in his own context. And I think that one of the biggest fallacies that we can fall into is sort of retro projecting our ideas back onto the fathers, because we want to sort of find, actus purus in the early church, or we want to find the essence energy distinction in the early fathers, when that's sort of a disingenuous way to look at it.
I think what you're saying really rings true for me, especially because when I was, reading through this dialogue, he's quoting Basil, who's arguing and contending with Eunomius. And to me, it seems like what Basil is getting at, maybe I'm misreading him, but to me, it seems that he is attacking a nominalist perspective that would just say these distinctions are entirely nominal. And that appears to be what Eunomius is holding. Again, please correct me if I'm wrong, but that's not what the Thomists is saying. That's not what the Scotus is saying. So, anybody would try to bring this, book against Eunomius as an attack against the Thomist. It's irrelevant, because it seems that they're not the same, because the Thomist is not saying that all of these, that the different activities of God just reduce to nothing but a nominalistic distinction. So to me, I think you're right when you say we have to read them in their context. And I think that a lot of apologists are perhaps reading too much into it. Eric, what do you think? Let me let you jump in here, give your thoughts and questions, and then I'm going to come to Dru, who has a few follow-up comments for us, and then we'll get into the chat questions.
Yeah, thank you for giving me the space. So that quote from Palamos that you read there, this is going back into some sort of a Platonic way, or of thinking, where there's the one and the many, but the one is in the many. So this has to be translated to Aristotelian categories and ways of thinking. So we can't really just go in here and think we're talking in the same space. But Palamos is definitely saying that in a certain sense, there is an identicalness, a sameness, a simplicity in God where there's no distinction. But he really does believe that there is another sense in which there is this multiplicity, this complexity. And this goes back to something that I've been thinking about for a long time, particularly between Augustine and what he said about the theophanies, because this is what comes up a lot in this discussion about where the West began to really go off kilter. And the question is, how does God get into creation? You can't take the infinitude of God, the simplicity of God, and cut a hole in creation and then sift God through that hole into creation. But at the same time, we read in scripture that God appeared, God did this. And there's one quote from Augustine I'd like to read, because this is where I think Augustine may come close to what Palamas is saying. Mm-hmm. And that is on the level of intellect. This is something where human beings can come together with God. After all, Aquinas said this is the home of worship in the human soul, is the mind. The intellect, God has intellect. We know that. He is, the utter, pure, infinite thought. Mm-hmm. And when he created us in his image, we have an intellect. There's a section from The City of God I'd like to read. And tell me, this kind of sounds like where we might be getting a bridge to Aquinas. He says this: "Nor should it trouble us that even though God is invisible, we are told that he often appeared to the patriarchs in visible form. For just as the sound by which we hear a thought, which was first formulated in the silence of the mind, is not the same thing as the thought itself, so the visible form in which God was seen, even though he is by nature invisible, was not the same thing as God himself. Nevertheless, it was God himself who was seen in that bodily form, just as it is the thought itself that is heard in the sound of the voice. And the patriarchs were not unaware that they were seeing the invisible God in a bodily form, which was not itself God." So what Augustine is talking about here, he's way ahead. I mean, he's really getting into this. I mean, he's a Middle Platonist, but he's really stretching out here, where how does God and human beings meet in the middle of the sandwich bread? And I think he's saying, just as when you listen to another human being speak a word and you receive the thought that comes from that word, the sensibility is not the same thing as the thought originating in the mind. But at the same time, you're uniting with that thought. Mm-hmm. Do you see?
Yeah.
So here's a way in which God, through an intellectual transmission, mm-hmm. can break into the world, can break into creation. And what we are really hearing is God. What we are understanding is God. And what we are receiving is God. And yet it's not the same thing as God.
Isn't this essentially the argument that he gives in De Trinitate, where he says, okay, the Son is basically God knowing himself, and that knowledge of himself is God, and yet it's not absolutely the same. And so he makes these distinctions between the Father and the Son that way.
It kind of makes a parallel with that. Yeah. But what we see here, oftentimes we get Augustine explained as if, Augustine builds this huge unbreakable wall between God and creatures, and, never the twain shall meet. But here, Augustine's going out on the limb here and saying that just like you can have a human being talking to another human being, and person B is receiving the thoughts of person A, and yet the thought itself in the human that spoke mm-hmm. is not the same as what is received into the human. But at the same time, it is truly the thought, because you're taking in what that person thought. Mm-hmm. So there's an identicalness, and then there's not an identicalness. So this is where I'm going back to Palamas, where he says, well, there's a sense in which we say these things are without distinction, and then there's another way in which these are plentiful and complex. I have another quote from Palamas, but I don't know if we have time, because I think Palamas
sneak it in, and then I'm going to come to Dru.
Yeah, because Palamas himself, I think, even comes to close to what Augustine's saying here when he's talking about his favorite narrative of the gospel. That's the Transfiguration. Mm-hmm. He says in the Triads, if an irrational animal happened to be present on the mountain would it have sensed that light brighter than the sun? I don't think so. For the glory of the Lord that shone upon the shepherds at the nativity of Christ, it is written, was not perceived by the flocks. How is it then possible that a sensible light is not seen by the eyes of those animals that can see the sensible? If the light on Mount Tabor was seen by the human sensible eyes, it was seen insofar as they exceed those of the animals. In which way do they exceed them? In what other way than by the fact that through the human eyes, it is the mind that sees, if not by the sensible capacity, for then even the animals would have been able to see it. Then by the intelligible capacity that comprehends through the senses, or rather not even that, for every eye, particularly those nearby, would have seen the light that was brighter than the sun. If then it was not seen, even through the intelligible capacity, then that light is not strictly speaking sensible. And if it is not sensible, it is eternal. For the divine light, which is also called in many passages the glory of God, is without beginning or end. Therefore, it is not sensible. So here we have a distinction in Palamos where he's talking about the temporality of the senses is not a medium through which we perceive the uncreated light. And this, I know it seems different, and obviously the Orthodox are going to want to talk about the enlightenment of the nous, and a different set of lens through which they understand and perceive God. But this may be a meeting place for where Augustine talks about that thought communion with God's word, God's thought being born in himself, but then distributed through sensible means. So it's kind of an inverse, but you do see the two coming together. So it's not, there is this sense in which there's the one, the many, and the one is in the many.
Zachary, I want to get your thoughts here in just a second on what Eric just said, but I think Dru also has a few comments and questions for you as well.
Sorry to take up so much time, Mike.
No, you're good. No, you're good. Dru, jump in here. I think you had some things to ask for Zachary.
Sure. It would, and hey, no worries. Like I said in the chat earlier, this is y'all's show. I just randomly drop a little science or history or something, and every once in a while.
And you bring the Dark Side T-shirt. That's great.
Hey,
I just now saw it. That's awesome.
Awesome band.
Yeah, and you gotta have a Star Wars T-shirt on every show.
Hey, got to. It's awesome. But anyway, so to get into the sciencey bits of things, when you look at the whole unmoved mover and things like that, it really does kind of fall apart as soon as you have an understanding of physics, especially once you get into Newtonian physics and beyond that into modern physics, because the issues with the unmoved mover stem from Aristotelian physics, the physics of motion and things like that, where motion, at least from an Aristotelian standpoint, is defined as the actuality of a potentiality. Nowadays, we kind of break that down into potential energy and kinetic energy. This is energy in motion. It is possible to be in an energetically ground state that is a net energy of zero. So if you have a ground level, this is your 0 point, and then you have anything such as, I'm just going to use this 10-sided die here. Okay, so potential energy is defined as, trying to remember off the top of my head, as mass times height times, I think it's gravity. So anyway, up at this height, with my desk being ground level, it has a certain amount of potential energy. Once it is in motion, that's its kinetic energy. But once it reaches that ground state, its net energy is now zero. There's no motion taking place here. There's no potential energy. There's no kinetic energy until an outside force acts upon it. And this is why the whole unmoved mover thing kind of tends to break down, because it relies on outmoded science that is no longer applicable based on what our current understanding of reality is as pertains to physics.
Zachary, what would you say in response to that? Would you say that's a misunderstanding of what we mean by act and potency?
Well, I mean, in a sense, yes, but a more interesting thing to look at is actually Ed Feser has an interesting paper on this very particular topic out of Fordham University, where he's dealing with Aristotelian physics, and basically there's kind of a misunderstanding when it comes to Aristotelian theories of physics. Aristotle isn't really dealing with the same questions that modern scientists are dealing with, so people like Isaac Newton and so on. But the main distinction that I would say, right, between a sort of Aristotelian understanding of motion and a Newtonian understanding of motion is that Aristotle doesn't think that there is like some external force or some external law that is causing things to move, right? What Aristotle is going to say that causes things to move, right, and motion for him is just change, is its nature. The nature, according to Aristotle's physics, is the principle of motion or rest that a thing has towards some end, right? So, whereas in a sort of modern Newtonian conception, right, we would say, if I have that 10-sided die and I drop it, it's going to fall. And why? Well, because there's some sort of external force, gravity, being applied upon the thing. Well, to Aristotle, there aren't like laws of nature, right? These external laws that are applied or sort of exerted upon substances, but rather substances have an intrinsic impetus or an intrinsic source of motion, which is their nature, right? And that might seem really weird. It's like, why would he talk about it in that sort of a way? Well, we have to understand Aristotle is trying to talk about motion as simply as possible, and he wants to talk about it in every sense that it can be talked about, which, roughly speaking, is just change, right? He wants to talk about, well, why is it the case that over time, if I have a log, it rots, or if I have something heavy, it's going to fall to the ground, or why is it that if an animal sees food, it goes towards it, right? And the basic gist of Aristotelian physics is that all motion, all of those examples which I gave are going to be considered, forms of motion, of change to Aristotle. And he's going to say, well, that's because it's not that there's some external law. There isn't something externally being forced upon the thing like gravity, but rather it's intrinsic to them. It's their nature. Now, to go back to the Ed Feser thing, the interesting thing about this is Ed Feser, what he does is he sort of reconciles an Aristotelian conceptualization of motion with Newtonian physics, with a modern understanding, because they're not really different. I don't think that there's anything in Aristotle's theory of motion which is necessarily repugnant to modern understandings of motion or physics, but it's just looking at it in a different way because Aristotle is asking different questions, right? He's asking, he wants to understand motion as generally as possible. And so what I would say with that, right, and how and the claim that that the argument for motion is based upon a sort of outdated theory of motion is that, well, I think that's kind of the wrong way to look at it, right? Because I don't think that there's really anything within Newtonian physics that has an objection to conceptualizing of change in terms of act and potency. Now, you did bring up a very particular example with potential and kinetic energy, and I honestly, last time I took a physics class was years ago, so I don't know how well I can engage that in particular. But what I would say, just sort of as my blanket answer to anyone who has an issue with Aristotelian physics, is that, well, I don't think that conceiving of change as the actualization of some potential is necessarily at odds with a modern conception of motion, And I don't even think that Aristotle's conception of motion is contradictory of a Newtonian system of motion. They're just looking at completely different questions, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I know quite a few physicists who still maintain Aristotelian categories and philosophies and are able to explain how they're compatible. So I think you're right. Dru, you had a follow-up there?
I do have a bit of a follow-up. Actually, Aristotle and Newton were looking at essentially the same thing and coming to different conclusions. And Newton was actually more correct. Aristotle was trying to define motion, yes, in a general sense, but it came from trying to discern what caused the celestial bodies to move, and that actually relied entirely on perfect motion, perfect orbits, and things like that, which we know break down, especially outside the local cluster, when we talk about the general and special relativity. Now that's getting into Einsteinian physics and trying to avoid that one right now because that's a really deep and long drawn out
topic. Essentially, Aristotle was responding to Zeno and his paradoxes, and that's why he was coming up with this. But maybe I'm misunderstanding.
When you look at the deeper analyses of it, excuse me, like for Aristotle to be a thing in the world is to be at work, to belong to anything, to act for a particular end, things like that. So actuality from Aristotle's sense is fairly close in meaning to kind of what it is to be alive. The only issue is it actually doesn't carry the implication of mortality. And then when you get to a definition of Aristotle's account of motion, this is actually pulled from, it's called the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It is actually a peer-reviewed resource. And that it has to include what are apparently inconsistent propositions, that A, that motion is rest, and B, that potentiality, which must be, if anything, is just a privation of actuality, is at the same time that actuality of which it is the lack. And Aquinas was prepared to take them seriously on this one. So motion is kind of the mode in which the future belongs to the present, in that the future is contingent upon the present. So what happens now affects what happens later. We don't know precisely what's going to happen later because of it, but we know that something we do now will have an effect later on. But Aristotelian physics, when you look at Aristotle, what we know of Aristotle through his students, was that he was trying to explain celestial bodies, explain their motion, explain their movement, but it relied on them being in a perfect orbit. And so when you look at unmoved mover from that particular standpoint as applied to celestial bodies, it becomes actually a fairly decent ancient argument for the existence of the force of gravity. Now, granted, that is absolutely a post hoc rationalization, and I wouldn't say that that's exactly what he's arguing for or what he arrived at, but it is a logical assumption that is what that could lead to. Not necessarily Aristotle.
I think Aristotle, sorry about the train coming through. I think Aristotle was dealing more than just the kind of motion you're describing. I think that we could speak about, for example, I go from a state of not loving to loving. That has absolutely nothing to do with the kind of motion that you're talking about, but that's an example of going from potency to act. Looks like in the chat, they're recommending that we read Feser on the medieval principle of motion and the modern principle of inertia. So I think what will be helpful is we could maybe read that, study up more on this, and I'll invite a guest on who is not only a scientist but also an Aristotelian, and we can tease that out further. I don't want to get too bogged down into this. If y'all want, go ahead and give us the call if anybody is watching live and they want to have they want to ask some questions. It's 903-480-0707. And of course, you can also ask your questions in the chat, but if you prefer a phone call, 903-480-0707. Zachary, did you have any follow-up commentary that you wanted to offer based upon what we just heard?
No, nothing in particular. I mean,
Okay.
I don't really want to reopen.
Yeah, no,
that,
I got you. Eric, what about you? Before we move to any kind of chat questions, did you have any quick commentary on what we heard from Dru?
Oh no, we don't have time for that. But
Okay.
I think Feser on the medieval paper. We'll have to link it into the show notes.
Okay. Yeah.
Once we get it going.
All right, I'll get it. Yeah, so Dru, if you don't mind, maybe go ahead and see if you can call out some of the chat questions for us.
Okay, sure thing. Looks like most of them are actually from one guy, Brandon Thorpe. And so his first question is, why should motion be the foundation for which to define, the foundation on which to define who God is, rather than what he did? Why should God be defined as his action rather than the origin of the action? And also, why should distinction necessarily entail full division? That's his kind of follow-up to that.
Zachary, do you want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's not as though we are like saying like, oh, we're not starting with God, right? That's the thing, right? And what I mean by that can sound like bad in a lot of ways to Christians, but what we're starting with here, right? If we understand Aristotle and we understand Aquinas, right? These are empiricists. These are people who believe that we begin with natural principles, right? And we come to these conclusions. And when we have God's existence, when we have the actus purus claim, it's not like this is some sort of arbitrary choice that we are using motion or something like that. What's happening in the argument for motion, right, is that you have Aristotle in his physics, right? He is trying to provide an account for change, right? And how do you provide an account for change? Well, he goes through it syllogistically and comes to the conclusion that there must be a being which itself is actual but is not actualized by another, right? And that's, something that I get into, I believe, in another video of mine where I talk about the distinction between, intermediary causes and causes which are their own, sufficient condition for causality, which would have to be a purely actual being. It's not as though this is sort of like a choice either, right? Because when you have some sort of a syllogism like that, right, you have two premises and a conclusion that follows necessarily, right? It's not as though you just choose an arbitrary starting point, right? What we're doing is we're working from the most fundamental natural principles, things which are common to all men, right? And then working up from that to God. And so it's not as though we've chosen to start with motion because we are trying to prove the actus purus claim. It's that we're trying to prove motion, right? Because Aristotle is responding to people like Parmenides and others who are saying that change is illusory, right? He's trying to prove motion, and in doing so, that leads us to the actus purus claim.
Do we have any more questions, Dru?
Can I say something to that?
Absolutely, sure.
Okay, yeah. It's also going back to our fundamental theology, where sometimes people see the introduction of God as personal. When God met with Adam, he didn't come down and say, I am actus purus, I am the uncaused cause, that type of thing. He came down and said, he introduced himself as he, as person. When God introduced himself to Israel, it was person. And so this personal encounter is sometimes thought of being squeezed out by natural theology. And that's not really what Zachary's denying, and Aquinas certainly wouldn't deny that. But what is a different angle that we're coming at this with. Yes, we can know the personal God who comes and acts mightily and fights for us, and who comes and saves us and provides for us and gives us children and gives us grain and gives us cattle. This is the Israelite, God, Jehovah Jireh. But there's another angle that we could look at this with, and namely that there is a revelation of God in nature. And we know that from the same authority of Holy Scripture. For example, when St. Paul told the Romans that through his invisible creation, we can know that God exists. Or in Acts 17, where for the first time, Paul is confronted with having to explain God to people who don't share a common encounter with the personal God. When he was talking with the synagogue, the people in the synagogue, he could speak of the God of our fathers. But when he spoke to the Athenians, the philosophers, the Greeks, and the pagans, he couldn't introduce, the God of our fathers said this, did this, called David. That's not going to work. So he works from a natural point of view of us being from God, him being cause, him being a formal cause, you could say, of all creation. In him and through him, we have our being. This is another angle through which Paul was willing to engage the question of who God is and how God is. And this is another aspect which I'm not sure the Orthodox, I don't know if they've tuned into this, and maybe they have, I'm sure they have. But for us, natural revelation is just as infallible as divine revelation. Revelation from God is always infallible. So when we say that God reveals himself in nature, that is infallible. And what we're doing is we're taking what we know and what corresponds to the mind and what we know, and we're reaching God through that, because the life of reason is not divorced from the life of sanctity, and nor through the pathway to God. So that's something I would say to that question about what, because sometimes we see all this talk about philosophy and people are like, Jesus Christ didn't come out like a philosopher professor, So anyway, that's what I would say to that.
Okay. Let me call out the number again, 903-480-0707, 903-480-0707. Dru, I think we have a few more, right, in the chat?
Yes, we do, actually. Brandon Thorpe seems to be asking most of the questions, and so I'm actually going to skip some of his earlier questions to get to this one, since it is a different individual. This comes from John DeRosa. Who should we read to understand Palamas better?
Zachary, do you have any comments on that one?
I mean, as far as I know, a lot of the reading that I've done with the Palamas issue is there was actually a really good paper written by a Dominican. I believe it was titled something like Palamas East and West. Mm-hmm. And especially if you want to understand this from a Thomistic perspective, he basically outlines the history, certain philosophical components of it as well, and how Thomists would deal with some of the objections that were being raised at the time of Palamas writing in his debates with Barlaam. There's also the Bekos blog, actually, which is really good, because as far as I can tell, I don't think that many of these original debates or a lot of the original manuscripts have even been translated into English. I think they've been translated into Spanish, but I know that the Bekos blog actually does have some of the documents dating back or relating to the Barlaam disputations on his website. And so those are two good sources that I know off the top of my head. But yeah.
Is that the Peter Totleben book that you're talking about, the Palamite controversy, a Thomistic analysis? Is that the one you're referencing?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah, it's really good. Some of it was over my head, but it was extremely good. He's supposed to come on the show at some point, still waiting on a date, but I think that would be very interesting if we can get him. Eric, did you have a follow-up on that one?
Well, you could get some English translations of Palamas on the triads. You can get there's actually a book I don't know if it's on my shelf here. It's called The Introduction to Gregory of Palamas, or Gregory Palamas. And it's a Greek name. But if you Google, or no, if you go to Amazon and type in Introduction to Gregory of Palamas, it's not the one by John Meyendorff. It's a Greek name. I can't get it off the top of my head, but that is well recommended. Yeah.
Okay. Any others there, Drew, from any other contributors, or is it mostly Brandon's questions?
It's mostly Brandon's questions at this time, but some of them are actually pretty good ones.
Okay.
I'll skip to his most recent one is God has several names, correct? So how does one extrapolate a pure, quote unquote, anything out of a simple, vague statement given to Moses at that time? And I might actually have a slight response to that one.
Zachary, what do you think?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I'm understanding the question very well. Do either of you understand what exactly
it seemed a little fuzzy to me. It almost sounds like he's saying, look, if God is simple, how can he have different divine names? Maybe I'm misunderstanding him, though.
No, I think it's not necessarily the simplicity aspect. It's how does one extrapolate purity or divine simplicity out of vague statements? He's specifying a simple, vague statement given to Moses at the time.
Okay, from Exodus.
Okay,
yeah. Okay,
and also,
from Exodus. Gotcha.
I think I found the book that Eric was talking about. It's Introduction to Saint Gregory Palamas by George C. Papademetrio.
Yes, that's the one.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. So, Zachary, how do you get this notion of simplicity? How does Aquinas get that from Exodus 3? I want to say it's 3:14, somewhere around there.
Well, I think I wouldn't say that Aquinas necessarily gets divine simplicity from that. But what he does seem to draw upon that quote from Exodus is his essence existence distinction, right? Where in God, right, whereas in most beings, in composite beings, and even in angelic beings, right, there is a distinction between what they are and their existence, right, between their essence and their existence. But what Aquinas would say is that there is no distinction between God's essence and his existence, which is why he would say, I am who am. What it means to be God is to exist because his essence is his existence. Mm-hmm. And so that's what that has more to do with that than it does simplicity. Mm-hmm. Although, I mean, they're all closely related, mm-hmm. right?
What was this on being an essence that he dealt with this primarily, or was it in the Summa, or both?
If my memory serves me correctly, this is dealt with in the Summa, and I think that this passage is even dealt with, or he cites this passage specifically in the Summa. I don't have it off the top of my head where he's doing, but I'm quite sure he talks about the essence existence distinction in the Summa Theologica.
Yeah, I vaguely recall him addressing Exodus 3:14 in there. Eric, any follow-ups there?
No, all I would say is that, when you do read Aquinas on this, I just think it's a caricature to say that Aquinas found this verse and thought, wow, this is where I'm going to get my idea from. I think we need to really get real about that. There's another book recommendation I do have, though, if there's no other questions, but we'll wait till the end.
Well, go ahead and throw it in if you don't mind.
Some of the books, some of the quotes I was reading from earlier, if anybody was interested, I actually recommend this book. I don't know if you could see it here on the, it's called The Unity of All. And it's by Father John Panteleimon Manoussakis. I'll botch the name. But there's a chapter in there with the title Created and Uncreated Light. And the subtitle is Augustinian and Palamite Approaches. And a short chapter. And this book really does try to come at it from let's take both views and translate them so that maybe there's a meeting place that we can join up our concepts and categories with. And there's some other chapters in here about Mary's Immaculate Conception, the Petrine Primacy, Will and Grace, Augustine and Maximus, the Confessor. So anyway, that might be a book that some of our listeners might want to read.
Yeah, and I'm gonna add it to the description of the video. I'm doing that right as we speak, so it'll be on there. Again, 903-480-0707. Now is your last chance to call. Dru, why don't you ask one more chat question if you don't mind, please?
Okay. My only addressal to the previous question is, if you're going to argue that a statement was made to Moses, like you're talking about in Exodus 3:14, would be first. Part of it would you have to necessarily prove that Moses actually existed. There's a lot of evidence actually refuting the historicity of that.
I think you and William are going to have a show on that. Is that right?
A show on historicity in general on August 24th on my channel, The Atheist Reformation. But yes, I'm sure that's going to be one of the topics. It's one of the ones that I've actually studied pretty in depth. But anyway, back to chat questions. Again, just assume they're from Brandon, unless I say otherwise at this point. This one is actually directed at Eric, but I think we may have already addressed this. Isn't motion by definition a change of states? And does God change? Is kind of his logical follow-up to that.
Is he asking, doesn't God change?
Or does God change, since motion is by definition a change of states, or at least that's how he's kind of and so because of that, does God change?
Yeah. Well, I'll let Zachary correct me here, but that's the whole point, is that there's the argument of motion is going back towards an unmoved, unchangeable beginning, which has no beginning. It's an infinite uncaused cause. So we're not trying to say that the argument of motion brings motion back into God, as if he makes a full circle back into motion, but that you don't have motion in you where you have motion, there is a required explanation for the motion, and that goes back to the unmoved mover. So I'm not sure if there's something more he's aimed at there with that question. I don't know.
I think what he may be talking about is the fact that he's defining motion in the sense of it means a change in state. So then I think what he's trying to say, if that's the case, then, well, isn't it the case that if God does anything, then he himself is moving?
Oh, okay.
Well, the thing is that it all depends on how you conceive of motion. If we're going to grant that motion is the actualization of some potential, right, then actualization itself doesn't actually involve motion in the actualizer. It only involves motion in the thing being actualized, right? There is no state change going on in the actualizer. And the reason why it's commonly thought, or why we commonly believe, or why it seems intuitive to say that it is the case that, actualization would involve some state change in the actualizer, is because that's often what occurs in any sort of causal relation that we observe. It is often the case, right, or almost always the case, that when we see that, something is being actualized, the thing which actualized it had itself been actualized. And we have a series of intermediary causes, right? Because what we can observe, any cause that we can observe is going to be an intermediary cause. We can't observe God, right, in this, in this human, on this earth, right? We cannot observe his actions, right? Or if we're going to do so, obviously with, the qualifications of, things like Mount Tabor, with the wonderful analogy that Augustine gave, where it's a sort of seeing of the intellect, similar to how the thought is in the word, right? But we only see intermediary causes, and because of that, it's very easy to think that actualization involves a change of state in the actualizer, but it doesn't, because motion is the actualization of some potential, right? And if that's the case, then the actualizer doesn't need to change in any sort of way. There's no motion involved at all. And I guess that's why we should distinguish between power and potency. Potency being the ability to change, and power being the ability to actualize a potency, or the ability to change another.
Yeah, that and that would also apply to like where we read in Scripture that where God does something, the Holy Spirit performs miracles through, like when our Lord raised people from the dead or stopped the storm in the Sea of Galilee. It wasn't as if the actualizer, God, came in to creation and came in and started moving in a time-space format to do these things. The actualized is what's moving. And, but we would say that the power behind that actualization has to be supernatural.
Exactly.
But he himself is not moved, in that sense.
Okay.
I would say so that would kind of incur a bit of a burden of proof in regards to somehow demonstrating that something can actually act outside of space-time in that regard, because looking at cause and effect, looking at causality, okay, sure, we can take everything within this universe and go back to what we conceptualize as a beginning point, the point of singularity, when the Big Bang occurred. This is a point of infinite density, infinite energy, and infinite mass. But in reality, that's really just where our mathematics break down when we start going backwards in physics to try and find the origin point. And that instant, that singularity, the Big Bang is, as far as we can understand, the beginning of time, because space-time are intermingled. They are one and the same. And so at that point, you'd have to be able to demonstrate that cause and effect somehow exists outside of our universe. Because as far as we know, cause and effect only exists within this universe. And there are some, I'm not saying Zachary or Eric or Michael, any of the three of you try to argue from this standpoint. It's just one that I see is quite common, is people trying to argue from a probabilistic standpoint. And that kind of doesn't work, because you have to look at your sample size. Your sample size is the universe, so you have a sample of one. And so you can't actually step outside that. But anyway.
Zachary, do you maybe have a follow-up? How do you deal with this when it comes to an uncaused cause outside of the universe?
Right. So when it comes to like cause and effect and being in the universe, well, I think the cause and effect relationship is metaphysical. And what I mean by that is that it's something which applies to ens commune, or all being in common, right? What it means to be something that has existence, or what it means to be a being, right, is going to involve, right, causality. Causality is something which is it is a metaphysical thing, because it applies to all things that have existence, right? And that's what I don't think that we can say something like, cause and effect only exist in this universe, and that outside this universe it doesn't exist, or I don't even know if I would say that the supernatural is like beyond the universe, because I guess it all kind of depends on what you understand to be the universe, right? If you understand the universe to be the set of all things that exist, right, then I mean, if you define it in that sort of way, then the supernatural and God is not outside the universe, right? But what I would say with regards to your question is that I don't really think that we can even talk about, a being, or what would it even mean to talk about something having existence that does not have the cause and effect, or that cannot have the cause and effect relationship predicated of it. What would that even mean? How could that be the case that there is something that doesn't have being, that or that has being that can't have either cause or effect predicated of it? That's one thing, but it's also, this kind of gets back to the sort of distinction between a Aristotelian understanding of things and a sort of modern understanding. When we think about cause and effect, right, it's not as though cause and effect is externally applied upon beings, like there's some law that exists that is a force upon things that exist. But I think that cause and effect is merely an emergent property of being, right? It's something that we have codified into law because we have observed it as a pattern of being, but it is not something which exists apart from being or exists on its own, right, as some sort of a law of the universe, but rather it's an emergent property of beings, if that makes any sense. And so I don't really see how it would even make sense to say that there could be things which exist but don't have cause and effect as things that can be predicated of them.
The reason I would say that that's what the burden of proof is for at that point is because as far as we are able to understand as human beings, as far as our intelligence and scientific testing can show, cause and effect is reliant upon time. Cause must come before effect. You can't have a cause after the effect's already happened. At that point, it's not a cause. Whoa. So with time being interlocked with space and also being what this universe is, that's where the argument has to come from, or the burden of proof has to be incurred, of asking, can we demonstrate cause and effect outside this universe? Right. Because so, time is necessary for cause and effect to occur.
Well, what I would say is that what I think is the problem here is that I think that we're maybe conceiving of cause and effect in different ways. I don't really think cause and effect is necessarily temporal, or that, because the way that Hume or many modern philosophers will define cause and effect is that it's just a sort of sequence of events where A follows B, like, consistently.
At that point, then time becomes absolutely necessary, because if you're saying that a cause comes before the effect, you are now imposing time, and when you impose time,
right,
it has to operate within the universe. And so unless we can show that time and even cause and effect exist outside of our universe, since time is interlocked with space, that's where I say that the issue comes into play, is that as soon as you say that something happens before something else, you have now made it temporal. It's necessary at that point.
Right, but does before necessarily mean temporally before? And what I mean by that is that we can talk about something like an essentially ordered causal series. And a good example of that, right, is if you have a potted plant that's being hung on your porch by a link of chains, right? That very first chain that's connected to the pot is a cause of the pot not being, not smashing and falling to the ground. It is a cause of it being held up. And then the next chain is causing it as well, and so is the next chain. But is it the case that that each chain prior in that sequence is temporally before? No, it's not that it's temporally before, but it's before in terms of it being a sort of hierarchical or a sort of horizontal or a vertical hierarchy, as opposed to a horizontal or temporal or linear sequence of causes. It's an atemporal causal series, right?
Actually, at that point, that analogy would kind of break down, because
Drew, let me jump in here. I think, Zachary, what you're getting at is what Feser called the hierarchical cause rather than a temporal cause. And Drew, I think what you could do is check out the Unbelievable show, where Ed Feser has a debate with an atheist about this, and they tease out some of these distinctions. I think what you're thinking of is something other than what Zachary's touching at.
And you said Unbelievable show with Ed Feser?
It's called the Unbelievable with what's his name, Briley or something like that. I'll send the link to you, and I'll probably put it in the description as well.
Yeah,
I think it'll be very helpful.
And going back to the whole start of that question, or that curiosity, is the miracles of God in creation. It's not as if God somehow is waiting on the outside of creation for a certain moment and then he comes in and does something. This is like the hierarchical cause that Zachary's talking about from the first cause, which is not something that is there and then has a point in time in which it's done. The first cause is the cause of all and the cause of everything to be and everything that will be. So, yeah.
It's premierchristianradio.com. So type that in and look up Feser. I think they were debating his book, 5 Proofs of the Existence of God. I'm pulling it up here with Arif Ahmed. So I think looks like it was back in the 2nd of December 2017. So I'll put a description or a link to it in the description, and we'll address that perhaps in more depth in another show. Zachary, did you have any concluding thoughts that you wanted to throw out there before we end?
No, I mean, I think that we got to deal with some, I guess, a lot of interesting topics, particularly pertaining to, the Godhead and the distinctions within the Godhead. And I hope that this video will be helpful to others who are in the same boat as me, learning more and, trying to grow in their faith through, the study of great theologians.
What's your next video going to be about on your channel?
So I kind of make videos on a case-by-case basis. That's my younger brother.
Yeah.
No,
hey, wait, I have 2 in the other room right now. So
we've all had that happen once. Don't worry.
You could probably hear mine any moment.
His hands and everything. All right. But I kind of make videos on a case-by-case basis. Obviously, I'm not in classes right now, but I'll be going back shortly and hopefully get back to that. It just sort of has to do with whatever I'm dealing with at the moment. So I'm not particularly sure. I don't really have anything planned at the moment, but I would like to get back to making some
if you don't have anything planned, might I steal you for a couple more shows sometime in the future?
Of course, yeah, of course.
Yeah, and if you're willing, I might try to steal you out for a show or 2 on mine. I think we'd have some interesting discussions.
Yeah, sounds fun.
Yes, indeed.
Awesome.
All right, Eric, any concluding thoughts?
So other than the YouTube channel, Zachary, is there a website or anything else, or is that the only venue that you're making yourself known by?
Yeah, no, just right now it's just YouTube, and I do have a Twitter account. It's at TradZach, ZACH on Twitter. But aside from that, it's just kind of really informal, kind of just doing this as a sort of hobby sort of thing. But yeah.
Hey, tell me, what exactly did you consult to come to a knowledge, a philosophical knowledge that you currently have of Aristotle and Aquinas? What were your primary readings? I'm sure the Summa, I'm sure Aristotle himself, maybe some of the secondary readings.
Right. So I would say that a lot of it has been reading, it's a myriad of sources, really. But the most that I actually learned was sort of in discussions with some of the great minds in the philosophy department at my university. The philosophy department there is actually heavily Catholic, so there's a lot of good Thomists in that department there, and I think I learned more from talking, with these professors, reading things at their suggestion. Than I could have ever on my own. It's one thing to sort of get into the texts on your own and read them, but it's another thing to have someone sort of guiding you who is well trained, in the given traditions.
That's true. I'm a little envious. It would be nice to have that. It sounds like you have a really good philosophy program that you're currently in. It's Hillsdale College. How far are you with the degree?
Right. So right now I'm 2 years in.
Okay.
And it's going very well.
Excellent.
Enjoying it. Hopefully getting to study some more modern philosophy. Because obviously I've spent most of my time with medieval philosophy
Yeah.
and scholasticism, so it'll be really interesting to get to study some.
Yeah, I imagine you'll want to get to Kant and interact with him. So, yeah. All right. Well, look, hey, I appreciate you coming on the show. This was excellent. Like I said, I'm going to see if I can steal you again for a couple more shows if you don't mind. So, but again, thanks for coming on. It was great having you.
Yep. Thank you.
All right, Eric, Dru, always a pleasure. Thank y'all.
All right. Thank you, guys. God bless you.
Oh,
God
yeah.
bless
Thanks for
y'all.
having me, guys.
Viewers, please comment, like, subscribe, share this material. And until next time, go share your faith.